Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith. All right, Matt, good to see you again. Thanks for joining me today on one of my favorite front porches.
Yes,
Matt and I
absolutely.
decided to sit out on my front porch tonight and do this episode because it's such a beautiful summer day.
It is. It really is.
And this
Here
is
in
Mokena's
Mokena.
front porch, so what better place to record than on a front porch? And we have a really interesting story. This one is about the Mokena's Mokena's railroad flagmen. So, Matt, maybe give a little overview of what were the flagmen.
Sure, yeah. Well, the flagmen were local men whose job it was basically to guard the railroad crossings in town before the advent of the electric gates that we have today and probably take for granted today that go up and down when trains are coming so people don't try to walk across or drive across the tracks. Well, once upon a time, there was a guy whose job it was to do that. And there was one posted at the crossing, at the Mokena Street railroad crossing, and another one on the Wolf Road crossing. I pretty much just focus on the Mokena Street crossing here, but and there even was a period where there was sort of like a movement afoot to get a flagman at what was called the school crossing, where nowadays we have what is now called Schoolhouse Road. That crosses the railroad. That never really got off the ground. But, they were men who had a flag, a physical flag.
And that was all there was no gate or bar they put down or anything to block the street. They just literally just a flag, right?
That's correct, yeah. When a train would come, they would stand in the road and kind of wave their flag just to make sure no one tried to interfere with the crossing at all.
So before we get into the story, we'll learn a little bit about, the history. Well, maybe tell a little bit how important the train is to our town.
Yeah, absolutely. The railroad is extremely important to the history of Mokena. If it wasn't for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad, or just the Rock Island, as it's called, Mokena wouldn't exist. There were people living here before the railroad was built in 1852, or I should say when it was completed in 1852. But without the trains coming, Mokena never would have been platted. Property never would have been bought. Buildings would never have been built, and our community would not exist today. So
when the train came through, what were the uses? Like, what was the use at first?
Mm-hmm. Basically the same thing as it is today. There were passengers. The Rock Island took people back and forth from Chicago to Joliet or to points further afield even. But there also were things like cattle, cargo, freight, dairy products like milk. Mokena has a long history of being a dairy shipping point, what with the Bowman Dairy having been here in all those years in the early 1900s. It's pretty much, we still have freight trains that come through Mokena. They're not loading and unloading anything here anymore, but they definitely
make their way through town a couple times a day.
Yeah, they do. All right.
Anybody that gets to experience the gates for periods of time enjoys that.
Absolutely.
And then how about where were there other flagmen in the area?
That's a good question. I'm pretty sure Tinley Park had flagmen as well. I'm not an expert on their history, but our tales sort of intersect. So I feel like I've come across references to their flagmen. I don't know if Frankfort ever did. Of course, Frankfort's not on the Rock Island. They were on the Michigan Cutoff. Believe it or not, for those who don't know, Frankfort was once a railroad town. I don't know if they had flagmen or not, but I could almost think they would have had to have. Flagmen were not an uncommon thing in towns across the country before the advent of electric gates, with ours having first been installed in 1944 here in town. So that's how far back we're talking.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 1852 is when the train first came through town.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what's the time frame of our story? We're kind of talking. What years are we looking at?
Yeah. This story in regards to the Flagmen kind of kicks off around the end of the 1890s, as we'll see. Something happened that really spurred the need for one. And kind of continues on, up into the 1940s, into the World War II years.
Up until they replace them with mechanical gates.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we're talking about the area on Mokena Street, which is right now there's kind of like the Metra building in the same or similar place. Is that right?
Yeah. So nowadays, if you can kind of like envision a map of Mokena in your head, on the north side of the railroad tracks at Mokena Street, there's a kind of like a prefabricated metal hut. That's there.
Like there's all the wires, all the mechanicals or something for the train goes through there.
Yeah. Sometimes you see the Metra workers going in and out of there working on stuff. Basically, right where that little building sits is where the Flagman Shack was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, good. So now everybody knows where we're talking about. Let's get into this really interesting story about Mokena's railroad flagmen.
As we Mokenians know, the roots of our village lie not just in agriculture, but also in the steel rail. The Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad is the reason for the village's very existence, and reflections on our collective past are filled with locomotives puffing soot. One image often overlooked in our mind's eye is that of the humble wooden shack on the north side of the Mokena Street crossing. Aesthetically speaking, the little shanty was totally unremarkable. However, it was from here that a generation of men worked a very important job. Known as flagmen for their tools of the trade, it was the responsibility of these Mokenians to assure safety at the railroad crossing in the days before electric gates. Working by themselves from the small hut, the flagmen were employees of the Rock Island who heralded the arrival of a train by standing in Mokena Street and waving a green flag, and later a small stop sign. While another flagman came to guard the Wolf Road crossing, the shack most widely remembered was the one that stood at the Depot Crossing on Mokena Street. Teasingly described by an early 20th century journalist as a mansion by the tracks, the shanty was far from it. Merely a small wooden building, roughly the size of a toll booth, complete with a stove and at least 2 small windows. The exact date of its construction has long since been lost to time, but sagely residents of Mokena would remember the shack first appearing as a response to a deadly accident that occurred around 1900. Comparing these memories with the historical record, it appears likely that the calamity recalled was the death of Irma Reese in 1896, a teenage relative of the McGovney family. She was killed by a rushing train for the simple yet tragic reason that she didn't look both ways while crossing the tracks. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, the village board asked the Rock Island to place a flagman at Mokena Street on or before June 15, 1896. Records indicate that a crossing guard had indeed been stationed at the crossing, but some unknown hiccup occurred that resulted in the railroad doing away with the flagman just as quickly as he had been posted. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, certain townsfolk unleashed a torrent of criticism on village trustees, who they perceived to be responsible for the guard's absence. The buck was passed to the general manager of the Rock Island Railroad, and while he refused to have a flagman placed on Mokena Street, he did compromise by suggesting that the local station helper perform the task. At a special meeting later that summer, village clerk John Leese drafted an indignant letter back to the company, wherein he described that this would be asking the impossible, for the overtaxed gent's responsibilities already included having to load and unload baggage, carry the mail bags to and from the post office, and attending to the loading of milk and unloading of milk cans. Regardless of when a flagman was permanently posted to the crossing and when his shelter was constructed, Mokena's train passengers knew it as a place to chew the fat or find solace within its walls on cold winter mornings. Among the earliest Mokenians to work the flagman's shack upon its installation were Patrick Brennan and Thomas Kinnery. both having settled in the village years before during its infancy. By 1909, Ferdinand Thun was on regular duty there. A middle-aged man of German birth, Thun waved a green flag and was praised that year by the Joliet Weekly News as having great artistic tastes and talents when he spelled the village's name in whitewashed brick and stone in the ground at the guardhouse. Not too long after this creation appeared, the status of Thun's shack as a hangout was threatened. The roadmaster of the Rock Island appeared in town to personally warn him not to allow people to gather there, and made it clear that any such huddlings were viewed as distractions from his duty. Apparently, the order had no effect, for soon thereafter another was passed down, this one specifically mandating no loafing.
On your blog post, this is where there is a picture on there of Flagman Ferdinand Thun.
Yes, that's him.
So can you maybe just, anything you can add to this picture? What where we're looking at? You see Mokena State Bank in the background there.
Yeah.
And he's standing what looks like on the railroad between two of the tracks there.
Appears to be, yeah. Looks like he's standing right there.
And like a wooden kind of walkway.
Yeah.
That's what the sidewalks were at the time.
Yeah, that's what the sidewalks were made of in town here before the advent of concrete sidewalks, which made their first appearance in Mokena around 1910 or thereabouts. So that would place it, a little bit before, or actually probably right around that time, because the bank wasn't built until 1909. And the concrete sidewalks didn't start sprouting up until, around that time. I mean, they were completed in bits and pieces.
Really interesting. No, and this is on Mokena Street, circa 1915.
Okay.
And a picture you got from Mr. Richard Quinn.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of his.
Always, we again post the link to this. So this is one of the photos, and then there's one more. But we'll talk about that when you get to that one.
Absolutely. Ferdinand Thun retired from his service at the crossing in 1922 at the lofty age of 70. At some point thereafter, Front Street resident and former butcher Paul Rinke Sr. took the helm, but it is unclear when and for how long. Sometime around 1931, Harry Shane succeeded Rinke as the Mokena Street flagman, who then manned the post for about 13 years. Called Slim by folks around town, Shane was a baseball fan whose radio carried the sounds of games down Front Street. One dramatic incident highlights Slim Shane's time as a flagman, namely the bravery he displayed saving the lives of two local women in 1941. Only days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the two ladies were disembarking from an eastbound train when one of them took an unfortunate tumble. With a westbound locomotive barreling down on them from the other track, Shane sprung into action and halted the departing eastbound, whereupon he then pressed the two ladies and himself flush against the side of a coach while the westbound sped past a foot and a half from their faces. Miraculously, no one was hurt, although a local news report mentioned that they all suffered greatly from excitement and shock. Well, initially delayed by World War II, electric gates were first installed at the Mokena Street and Wolf Road crossings in the fall of 1944. Flagmen in the village were now made obsolete, and Slim Shane was sent to Joliet to work on a crossing there. With no use for the flagman's shanty, the old haunt was sold privately and moved to the new Sunny Acres subdivision just north of town, where it was converted into a shed. Noting the demise of the hut, Mokena's news bulletin invoked its status in the village by referring to it as an old landmark. From here, it faded into the pages of history. Well, an era ended, the stories of the unique men who waved the flag here have forever been sealed into Mokena's story.
Very interesting, and something that people today would probably never understand or
Probably
have the
not.
idea of.
Right.
Other than like a school crossing guard.
Right.
So talk a little bit about the picture, this other picture that's included here that shows the mansion by the tracks, around 1915. Couple guys sitting out on boards out there. It was kind of just the hangout.
Yeah, pretty much. That's what all accounts kind of indicate, that it was just kind of a place where guys would kind of stop and peek in from time to time and see what was going on with the Flagmen, or maybe talk with maybe one or two of the other guys that was kind of hanging out there. It was known as a place, as I believe I referenced, for, maybe in days when the weather wasn't so great, it was not a big building, but you could fit a few people in there to kind of get out of the elements.
Yeah, and these guys are all dressed up too. They got their top hats on and suits and everything.
Yeah,
so, but yeah, really interesting picture. Neat to see, a little bit of Mokena left there in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is, our 4th of July episode. And Matt, you mentioned there was a story related to these railroad men and the 4th of July.
It's an interesting little story. Just kind of paints a little bit of a picture of times gone by. On July 4th, 1901, as the town was celebrating Independence Day, Flagman Patrick Brennan, from his spot at the shanty or shack, what have you, he was manning his post, and as he was looking to the northeast, he spotted some smoke, some smoldering that was coming from the roof of the Rouse blacksmith shop. And he was able to put two and two together and realize that a fire had started on the roof of this little building. How it started, we don't know. Was it a spark from a firework or something, or a spark from the funnel of a locomotive, or what have you? We don't know.
And where was the building that was on fire that he saw?
Sure. That building stood on the south side of Front Street, on the site or in the footprint of the building that is now there. That was Mr. Ozinga's office, his campaign office. That building is something like at least the 4th building that stood on that site. But yeah, the old Rouse blacksmith shop around the turn of the 20th century stood there, and that's what Mr. Brennan spotted from his Flagman shack at the Mokena Street crossing. The fire in its infancy that was starting,
wow,
and the roof catching fire. So through his alertness, he was able to get the bucket brigade together, and they were able to put out what could have been a pretty nasty fire that day.
Wow. Yeah.
So, yeah.
On the 4th of July.
Yeah, exactly.
So with the Flagmen, did they have a schedule that they knew the trains were coming through? Did they just keep their eye out for trains coming? Do you know how that worked? Any idea?
Yeah. I do not know for sure, but I'm sure that they had a schedule, or that they had at least a good idea as to when the trains would be coming. But if something was coming unexpectedly, I'm sure that they still kept their eye out. Yeah, they had a job to do, and they did a very good job of it. As we saw in the case of Slim Shane, even saved lives.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how scary to face down a train like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, you don't really even think that these were jobs in the past,
Oh, yeah.
How many,
yeah.
But it was vital to our town and to our downtown. And
oh, sure. Yeah.
And then the fact that we didn't have one by the school is pretty interesting too. But,
right. Yeah.
And that had to be, the school right across the street, and the kids were going across the tracks to play sport.
Yeah.
That had to be terrifying at times.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. That's what happened. Yeah.
Not to end on a down note.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, Matt, thank you again. Another great story. Thanks for bringing this, sharing the story. Happy 4th of July to you.
Happy 4th, Mokena.
Which is one of my favorite holidays in town for sure. I love
definitely.
The parade and everything going on. So enjoy that, and we will see you next time. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're enjoying our show, it would really help us out a lot if you would leave us a rating and a review, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as share our show with your friends and your family. There's a link in the show notes to Matt's blog article that this episode was based on, so be sure to check that out. If you have any ideas for a show or have any questions we can try to answer, please send us an email at mokenasfrontporch@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and hopefully answer your question on the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.